She wasn't even mentioned in her daughter's obituary. No phone call, no warning, just a message from a friend. "I'm so sorry for your loss." What followed was a descent into a funeral she wasn't invited to, a grief she wasn't allowed to feel in a daughter's life that had been carefully rewritten by someone else. But when the mother found her daughter's hidden letter, everything changed. This isn't just a story about loss. It's a story about erasure, control, and DE. A mother's quiet rebellion to uncover the truth no one wanted told. What really happened to Claire? And why was her mother locked out of goodbye? It began with a vibration, gentle buzz from her phone and the bottom of her purse one she nearly ignored. She was standing in the produce aisle at the corner market, debating whether the apples looked bruised. When the notification lit up, a message from Marcy, her colleague from the library. "I'm so sorry for your loss," it read. No context, no follow-up, just those 6 words, hanging like fog. She blinked at the screen, confused. There had been no call, no email, no whisper of bad news. She stared at the message as if staring. Long enough would make it explain itself. Her hand shook as she typed back, "What loss?" Marcy responded with a link. It led to a digital newspaper obituary. Claire Elaine Darrow, 32 of Greenville, passed peacefully in her sleep this past Thursday. Beloved wife of Thomas Darrow, cherished friend. Fiercely loyal, an artist, a dreamer, a voice of light in a dim world. The air left her lungs before she realized she'd stopped breathing. Her daughter, her only child. She read the paragraph over and over again, disbelieving it like a bad translation. Every word was a dull strike to the chest. She was frozen in place among rows of kale and citrus, unaware that her cart had begun to drift slowly down the aisle. It wasn't just the announcement that shattered her. It was the way her name wasn't there. No mention of a mother. No mention. A family only of a husband and a life that on paper she seemed to have no part in. There were no quotes from friends or childhood stories. No mention of Claire's time spent on stage as a high school actress, or her obsession with Van Gogh's Starry Night that once prompted her to paint it across her entire bedroom wall. Instead, it read like a eulogy written by someone who had met her through her resume clean. Formal, sanitized, her daughter compressed. Into a stranger's summary, she fumbled through her bag with numb fingers, calling Claire's cell phone, even though she knew it was pointless. Straight to voicemail. Her voice cracked as she left a message that wouldn't be heard. "Claire, baby, please call me. Please tell me this isn't real." It didn't ring again. She tried Thomas next, though she hadn't spoken to him in months, not since the terse Thanksgiving dinner when he accused her, over dry turkey and cold potatoes, of undermining Claire's decisions. The call rang 5 times before disconnecting. No voicemail, just silence. Still in her car in the market parking lot, she Googled the funeral home mentioned in the obituary. Their website confirmed the service would take place in 2 days at St. Ignatius Parish. Private ceremony by family request. She was not asked, she was not told. She was not family yet, at least not anymore, according to whoever wrote that. Notice, her hands clenched the steering wheel. Not in anger yet, but in disbelief. As if she could squeeze clarity out of the leather. As if gripping tightly enough would wake her from this unreality. She stared at the printout she'd made of the obituary from the grocery store printer. It lay on the passenger seat like a message in a foreign language addressed to someone who didn't exist. Claire had asthma. That's what the article said. Complications from chronic respiratory illness. She had always been delicate when it came to winter. Still, to hear she had passed peacefully in her sleep with no context, no call, no last chance to say goodbye, felt like being shoved out of her own story by the time she returned home. Evening had gathered around the porch like heavy smoke. She sat on the front steps, the obituary still clutched in her hand, the words blurring as the first tears fell. Not loud sobs, just the slow leaking kind that come when the world shifts and you're the only one left aware of the imbalance. She cried not just for the loss of her daughter, but for the loss of knowing, of being included, of mattering enough to be told. Somewhere in the distance, a neighbor's wind chime clinked softly in the gathering dusk. She wondered if Claire had suffered, if she'd been alone, if she'd wanted to call her mother, but couldn't. The next day, she phoned the funeral home again. This time, she asked directly if her presence at the service would be allowed. The man on the line paused, shuffled some papers, then cleared his throat. "Mrs. Darrow, I've been instructed to limit attendance strictly to those on the approved list." She didn't need to ask who made that list, and just like that, the funeral was no longer a farewell. It had become a locked room, a room in which her daughter would be eulogized, buried, and mourned by others. While she stood outside, invited, unnamed, and unacknowledged. But she wasn't done, not by a long shot. The first time she met Thomas Darrow, he wore a red scarf, too tightly wrapped around his neck, and introduced himself with a kind of handshake that told you exactly how long he had practiced it. Not too firm, not too weak, perfectly engineered like everything else about him. Claire had brought him home for Christmas, beaming with the pride of someone who'd brought back more than just a guest. "He's brilliant, Mom," he said, "works in finance, but he paints on the side. Watercolors, you'll love him." She didn't love him. Not that day. Not the next. There wasn't anything overtly wrong with Thomas. That was part of the problem. He was polite, punctual, generous, with compliments that sounded pulled from a manual. He laughed at the right moments. He helped with the dishes. And yet, when Claire left the room, he grew still in a way that felt rehearsed, watchful, like a man waiting for the scene to end so he could step off stage. Something about his silence had edges. Over the years, that silence thickened. Claire's phone calls home became shorter, often distracted. Sometimes she spoke in a voice that felt just slightly out of tune, like an old piano played by someone who remembered the song but not the key. When her mother asked how things were, Claire would always smile too quickly and say, "Busy, you know, but good. Always good." The holidays became a performance. Thanksgiving dinners filled with small talk so brittle it felt like walking on ice. Her mother would bring out the old family dishes, the cranberry glassware Claire loved as a teenager, but Claire never seemed to notice anymore. She'd offer to help, only for Thomas to interject that she was tired, that he would handle it. "She's had a long week," he'd say, placing a gentle hand on Claire's back. It looked like affection. It didn't feel like it. The mother watched it happen slowly. A social drift, quiet excommunication by erosion. First came the missed birthdays, apologies, and gift cards sent late. Then the canceled visits. Then Claire stopped mentioning things altogether. The promotion at work, the trip to the coast, the art show she once would have invited her mother to attend with pride. When the mother asked, Claire would say, "Oh, I didn't think you'd want to come all the way out." And Thomas Saw was hovering in the background like a shadow that had learned to smile, never contradicted her, never raised his voice, never slammed a door. Instead, he used subtler tools: implication, suggestion, the faint air of superiority he carried like expensive cologne. "Your mom's great," he once said after dinner, as Claire dozed on the couch, "but she's very involved, isn't she?" The word clung like a cobweb. Involved too much. Too close. She remembered the moment with surgical clarity. Claire, once so confident and untamed, now carefully measuring her words when they spoke. Asking, "Is it okay if I come for the weekend?" as though she needed permission from someone. Not on the call. Then there were the gifts that never arrived. The card she'd sent Claire on her anniversary that was returned unopened, address unknown. The voicemail that Claire swore she never received. Little slippages, easy to excuse individually, impossible to ignore in accumulation. On one occasion, she brought it up carefully. "Are you sure? Everything's all right?" Claire had stiffened. "Please don't start, Mom. I don't want drama." Had it cut. Not because it was harsh, but because it was the kind of thing Thomas would say in exactly that tone. Claire had started borrowing his cadence, his lines, his emotional shorthand. Eventually, the mother stopped asking. Not because she no longer cared, but because the asking itself had become a wedge. She learned to ration her concern, to smile at the right moments. To say things like that sounds wonderful, even when Claire's eyes seemed dimmer with every visit. The last time they saw each other in person was at a dinner hosted in Claire. In Thomas's new condo, it was sleek, white, and cold. like a showroom. Claire had cooked, but it was Thomas who served the plates, corrected the wine selection, answered every question before Claire had the chance. When the evening ended, the mother hugged her daughter tightly and whispered, "You don't have to be anyone you're not, sweetheart." Claire pulled back and gave a soft, practiced smile. "I'm exactly where I need to be, Mom." But her eyes said something else later, driving home through the dark. The mother couldn't stop thinking about the way Claire's hand lingered near her wrist when they said goodbye. Like she wanted to say something else, ask something. But the moment passed. It always passed. And now, years later, as the funeral approached one she hadn't been invited to, she realized just how long her daughter had been slipping away. Not in sudden heartbreaks, but in a slow, deliberate exile that had begun with silence and ended with erasure. She read it again, as if the words would rearrange themselves if she stared hard enough. Her eyes scanned every line, searching for the error that wasn't an error at all. Clara Lane Darrow, 32, beloved wife, cherished friend, a bright light in the lives of all who knew her. The usual phrases, elegant, impersonal, final, but nowhere in that neat column of digital ink did her name appear. Not once. Not even a generic "survived by family." She had been erased. It was one thing to not be told, to learn of your own child's death through a forwarded article instead of a phone call. But this was something else. This was deliberate, calculated, a surgical omission. She leaned back in the wooden chair at the kitchen table, the one Claire had once curled up in as a teenager, sketching faces into the margins of her math homework. The same table where birthdays had been celebrated and arguments smoothed over with slices of pie and forgiveness. She placed the printed obituary flat. Against the surface, the words glared up at her, sterile and public. No daughter of, no survived by her mother. As though she had never existed in Claire's life at all. Outside the window, the trees swayed gently in the wind, but everything inside her felt unnaturally still. Grief had frozen. Rage had not yet arrived. There was only disbelief. And beneath it, the kind of hollow ache that came not from death, but from being denied the dignity to mourn. She picked up the phone and called the newspaper. The woman who answered sounded young, bored, unsure how to handle emotion when it bled through the line. "I just want to know who submitted the obituary," she asked quietly. "I'm sorry, ma'am. That information's private. We can't disclose I'm her mother," she said, her voice breaking for the first time. A pause. Not a long one. Not long enough. "It was submitted by Mr. Thomas Darrow, ma'am." Her spouse, of course. Who else? She thanked the woman and hung up, then sat in silence as the refrigerator hummed and clicked beside her. Her mind began peeling, the memory back like layers of wallpaper. The first birthday Claire celebrated after her marriage, she'd received a card typed, not handwritten, from both of them, "Wishing you well." No mention of the necklace Claire used to borrow every year on that day, no photo inside, just a hallmark sentiment in Thomas's tight, mechanical font. That had been the start. Now, even in death, Claire had been curated, presented to the world through Thomas's lens. A wife, a friend, an abstract light. Nothing about the daughter who once taped sunflowers to her ceiling or stayed up all night sobbing over stray cats and broken hearts. Nothing about the girl who loved her mother with a kind of fierce, unshakable loyalty, till someone else told her to define love differently. She rose slowly and walked to the hall closet, pulling down the box labeled Claire. Inside, time lived in photographs and glitter-smudged birthday cards. A ballerina costume, folded carefully. A crumpled playbill from the school's production of Our Town, where Claire had played Emily and cried on stage like she meant it. Port cards with smiley faces. A dried corsage from prom. All of it proof that their lives had been intertwined. Real, unforgettable. She stared at a picture of them, together at the beach, arms around each other, salt in their hair, smiles squinting into the wind. A moment now rendered invisible by a man with a pen. What kind of love erases someone from your story? Later that evening, she sat at her desk and wrote her own obituary. Not for publication. Not yet. Just something she needed to see on the page. Clara Lane Darrow, Born of Margaret Elise Whitmore, artist, daughter, beloved, complicated, brave, lost too soon. She didn't know what funeral speeches Thomas would allow, or who would read what, or whether anyone would even mention the woman who brought Claire into the world. But she knew one thing with certainty. Her daughter had a mother. And no man, not even a husband with a spotless tie and a locked heart, could rewrite that truth. She waited until morning before calling. The funeral home's name had been buried in the last line of the obituary, barely a footnote, as though the ritual of goodbye were a formality to be dispatched with minimal disruption, as though it mattered only in a symbolic sense. But for her, it was everything. The woman who answered had a voice like tissue paper thin, professional, apologetic before anything had even been said. Morningfield and Sons, this is Deborah speaking. How may I help you? Yes, she replied, her voice careful. I'm calling about Claire Darrow's service. I'd like to confirm the details. There was a pause, the kind that tightens the chest with dread. May I ask your relation? To the deceased? I'm her mother, she said, placing each word slowly, deliberately, as if she were setting down fragile glass. Another pause. Longer. I'm very sorry for your loss, Deborah said, but her voice had changed, coded now with the kind of measured tone used in customer service scripts when things begin to veer into policy violations. As per the family's request, the service will be private. Attendance is restricted to invited guests only. Family's request? She asked, though she already knew. I am her family. I understand, ma'am. I really do. But we've been instructed to limit attendance to the approved list. I'm not authorized to. Who gave you that instruction? Silence again. Then, Mr. Darrow. She closed her eyes. Of course. Thomas. His hands in everything. Even now. There was a strange, slow burn rising in her chest. Not fire exactly, but something colder, heavier. A locked door where love had once been. Did he say, why? I'm not at liberty to discuss that, Deborah said, her voice dropping an octave in discomfort. You're welcome to leave a message for the family. No, thank you. She ended the call gently, though her hand trembled as she set the phone down on the kitchen counter. The window beside her was fogged with morning dew. Outside, the world looked soft, harmless. But inside, something had begun to fracture. She stood for a while in the quiet kitchen, listening to the tick of the wall clock and the distant rumble of a garbage truck turning a corner. It was surreal how ordinary the day continued to be birdsong. Mail delivery, life. And yet somewhere across town, plans were unfolding without her, decisions being made, flowers selected, eulogies written, a coffin prepared. Her daughter's body cold now, maybe dressed already, waiting to be seen one last time by people deemed acceptable. By Thomas, not by her. The word uninvited echoed in her chest, not absent by accident, excluded by design. It didn't feel like grief yet, not fully. It felt like trespassing, as if she were mourning someone she had no permission to claim. Later that afternoon, she drove to the funeral home, not because she thought it would change anything, but because she had to see it. The building was modest, old brick and limestone, ivy creeping along one side, in a discreet parking lot shaded by elm trees. She didn't get out. Just sat there, engine running, staring at the double doors with the brass handles. Trying to imagine what it would look like on the day. Would Thomas arrive early, adjusting his tie in the reflection of the glass? Would someone read a poem Claire hated? Would they play music she'd never listened to? She gripped the steering wheel, not out of anger, but to steady herself. All those years of scraped knees, midnight fevers, forgotten lunchboxes, whispered bedtime. Songs, and now she was just a name omitted from a list. Not even a line of condolence offered. Just erased. There was no number to call, no protocol to challenge. When grief became bureaucracy, calcified into something untouchable. She drove home as dusk began to settle, but something inside her had changed. She no longer hoped for permission. She no longer expected a place at Thomas's table of curated grief. The funeral might be locked, but mourning real. Mourning was never something a man like him could control. She would say goodbye, just not the way he expected. It was a Tuesday the last time they spoke. Late afternoon. It's one of those strange, indistinct days when nothing happens but everything feels fragile. She remembered it not because of what was said, but because of what wasn't. The call had lasted 13 minutes, most of it taken up by polite catch-ups and half-hearted laughter. But beneath it all, there was a hum-like static just beneath the surface. Claire had sounded tired, not sleepy tired, but soul-tired. The kind of fatigue that seeped into her voice like fog rolling in from some unseen place. She'd said, "Sorry I haven't called in a while," which wasn't unusual. But the way she said it was measured, like she was managing something invisible. Her mother had instinctively wanted to ask more, to press gently, but she hadn't. "You sound a little off," she'd offered instead. Choosing caution over confrontation, Claire had gone quiet for a second too long, then answered with a thin smile audible even through the phone. "Just a long week. Honest's work stuff. You know how it is?" She didn't know how it was. Not really. Claire rarely talked about his work anymore, just vague references to meetings, client dinners, a constant stream of projects that kept him always slightly elsewhere. Once upon a time, Claire had shared everything, the details, the irritations, the strange moments that made up a relationship. But lately her stories had shrunk, rehearsed, diluted. "I miss you," her mother had said. Another pause. Then, "I miss you too." It hadn't been a lie. Her voice had cracked just slightly, the way it used to when she was holding something back. But the moment passed quickly, and Claire pivoted into safer territory, an old story about high school. Something about her painting class, and a teacher who'd once accused her of being too dramatic in her shading. They laughed. It was easy. It was almost normal. And then the call had ended, not abruptly. Not painfully, just unfinished. She didn't remember hanging up. She remembered only the feeling afterward. That vague sensation of something left unsaid. A thread, not quite. Tied. And now, that silence had hardened into permanence. Now there would be no follow-up call. No second chance to ask the questions she'd been too afraid to voice. The door had closed, and on the other side all that was left were echoes. Now sitting in the same room where she'd taken that call, she stared at the cordless phone dock like it might somehow rewind time. Like if she held it long enough, Claire's voice would rise again from its plastic shell. She pulled out her old call logs, flipping back through recent weeks like a forensic analyst, searching for a clue in plain sight. There it was, Tuesday. 3:42 p.m. duration. 13:17. Her fingers hovered over the page. Strange guilt had begun to bloom. Not guilt for anything she'd done, but for everything she hadn't. For not asking why Claire sounded like she was reading from a script. For not demanding to know what was pulling her daughter further away with every call. But underneath the guilt was something stronger. A quiet conviction. Claire hadn't wanted this. Not the cold obituary. Not the locked funeral. Not the stifling narrative crafted by a husband who managed emotions like ledgers, neat and balanced. Claire had always been chaotic in the best way, emotive, expressive. The kind of person who cried during dog food commercials and stopped mid-walk to admire sidewalk chalk drawings left by strangers. No, she would have wanted color. Art, laughter. Between tears, she would have wanted her mother. She wouldn't have wanted this, she whispered aloud, her voice barely audible, as if speaking it too loud might make the absence Ariel. It had always been the two of them, at least until Thomas, through scraped knees, school plays, college acceptance letters, and heartbreaks. They'd been messy, yes, but close, real, and in her bones. She knew her daughter would never have chosen to disappear her. Whatever had built this wall wasn't Claire's choice. It had been engineered, and that meant it could be dismantled. Not by confrontation, not with shouting, but with presence. She didn't need an invitation. She only needed to remember who Claire had been before the silences, before the omissions. And she would honor that, even if it meant breaking every unspoken rule. Even if it meant standing alone. The erosion hadn't been sudden. That's what made it so insidious. If it had happened all at once, a shouted ultimatum, a slammed door, she might have known what she was dealing with. But Thomas didn't operate that way. He didn't burn bridges. He quietly redirected the rivers that flowed to them until one day you woke up and realized you were alone on the bank. It began, she realized later, with the small things. A voicemail Claire never mentioned. She had left it one night after a minor surgery, nothing serious, but something that warranted a daughter's voice at the other end of the line. Claire hadn't called back, which was unusual. When she finally did, 3 days later, her surprise had seemed genuine. "I never got a message," she'd said. "I left one," her mother replied. A little too sharply, Claire had grown defensive, then softly, carefully. "Maybe I didn't check my voicemail. I've been busy." But she always checked her voicemail. Then came the birthday package. A locket her mother had found in a vintage shop, polished and tucked in a box with a photo of Claire as a toddler. Folded inside, she'd sent it 2 weeks early, just to be safe. Claire never mentioned it, not a word. At first she assumed it had gotten lost in the mail. She waited a week after the birthday, then called. "Did you get the package I sent?" She asked. There was hesitation. "No." "What package?" "The one for your birthday. I mailed it to your apartment." "Oh," Claire said after a long pause. "Thomas checks the mail now. He said there wasn't anything from you." The words landed like an open palm to the face. She didn't argue. She just sat in her living room afterward, hands in her lap, imagining that little box buried at the bottom of a drawer, maybe unopened, maybe discarded altogether. What disturbed her most wasn't the idea that Thomas had intercepted it. It was that Claire hadn't gone looking. A pattern began to form. Invitations politely declined, calls shortened. Her daughter's once effusive emails became short lines of text. "Hope you're doing well. Things are good here. Let's catch up soon." They never did. Holidays sharpened the distance. Thanksgiving was the first fracture. Claire said they were spending it alone that year, just needing some quiet. The following year, Christmas was too stressful. And after that, there were no invitations at all. Still, she tried. She sent postcards, flowers, notes. She kept track of Claire's art exhibitions, even if she was no longer invited. She read reviews, collected photos from gallery websites, and imagined her daughter walking those polished floors, pretending everything was fine. Then came the message from an old neighbor, someone who'd run into Claire at a bookstore in the city. She looked thin, the neighbor said over the phone. Tired, polite, but off. Off how? She'd asked, like someone trying too hard to seem okay. She remembered thanking her and then sitting in the silence of her home, where Claire's laughter no longer echoed down the hallway, where the dust gathered on photo frames no longer updated, where love had become a kind of unanswered prayer, and still no rupture, no confrontation. Just the slow withdrawal of warmth. Sometimes she wondered if Claire even realized it was happening. If she thought she was choosing distance, or if that distance was being chosen for her. Gaslighting doesn't announce itself. It whispers. It rewrites memory in increments. Claire had once been opinionated, fierce in her convictions. But over time, her edges had dulled. She second-guessed herself more. Maybe I overreacted, she would say about things that should have made her furious. Maybe he's right, I do get too emotional. Thomas had mastered a language of quiet control. He never forbade, he suggested, didn't isolate Claire violently. He simply reshaped the space around her until there was no room left for her mother, and by the time anyone noticed, the door had already been closed. Now, standing on the outside of that locked door, she traced the outline of every step that led here. The message is lost. It's the gifts that never arrived. The woman Claire had become not less loving, but less free. She hadn't lost her daughter all at once. She'd lost her in pieces. And Thomas had carried each one away in silence. It was 2 days after the obituary had been published when the message came in. Short, hesitant email with no subject line. Buried between a utility bill and a coupon for gutter cleaning. It was from a name she hadn't heard in years, Melissa Jennings. Melissa had been Claire's college roommate. They'd stayed close long after graduation, at least for a while. She was the one who'd accompanied Claire on road trips, who helped paint that mural in Claire's old bedroom the summer after undergrad. Claire had called her my emergency contact in human form. Message was brief. "Hi, I just saw the news. I don't know what to say. I'm so sorry. I've been thinking about you. There's something I've wanted to tell you for a long time, but I wasn't sure it was my place. Maybe now it is. Could we meet? She agreed without hesitation. They chose a small park near downtown. One of those tucked-away green spaces where the world felt far off and polite conversation could be suspended. She arrived first and sat on the garden bench near the dogwood trees. Twisting her wedding ring absently as she watched joggers pass by, Melissa appeared 10 minutes later, a little older, paler than she remembered. With a stiffness in her posture, Dad said, she'd rehearsed this meeting in her head too many times. She hugged awkwardly, then sat down and stared ahead at the pond, where 2 ducks floated in lazy silence. I still can't believe it, she said quietly. Claire, gone. It doesn't feel real. No, her mother replied. It doesn't. There was a long pause. Not uncomfortable, just necessary. Then Melissa took a deep breath and began. I stopped hearing from her about 2 years ago, she said. Slowly at first, fewer texts, no more phone calls. I thought it was just life, distance. But then she canceled on a trip we'd been planning for months. No explanation, no apology. Just said she couldn't come. And when I asked why, she told me something that's been stuck in my head ever since. Her voice trembled slightly. She said, Thomas doesn't think it's healthy for me to be around you. The words landed like a stone in water. Melissa looked at her, its eyes sharp now. I asked her what that meant, if something had happened. She said no, but the way she said it was like she was trying to convince herself, not me. And then she said, he thinks you're still too close to my mother. He says that's not good for me. The bench creaked beneath him. The wind moved through the trees like a hush. He thought I was bad for her, Melissa continued. Gosh. I reminded her of you. Her mother didn't speak, not yet. Her breath came slow and controlled, but her hands gripped the edge of the bench as if it might tilt her world again. I didn't know what to do, Melissa said. Claire seemed conflicted. Not scared, exactly, but weary. Like keeping peace in her house required constant calculation. After that call, she stopped responding. I tried for months. Birthdays, holidays, nothing. They sat in silence as the ducks floated by again, different to the small collapse of truth occurring just yards away. She never would have wanted this, Melissa whispered, to be boxed off, cut away from people who knew her before Thomas, before everything. I know, her mother said quietly. Why didn't I push harder? Melissa asked. Why didn't I fight to stay in her life? Because when someone starts building walls around themselves, her mother replied, they make you feel like respecting the wall is love. And now the walls had become permanent. Brick and stone. A funeral with no invitation, life carefully rewritten. And yet here in the warmth of a friend's voice, something of Claire flickered back to life. A piece of her no obituary could erase. She loved you, Melissa said finally. She never stopped. You were her grounding wire. He just didn't want her grounded. They parted with a quiet embrace, no promises, just a shared ache. But as she walked back to her car, her mother felt something different humming inside. Her, not anger, not grief, something sharper. She wasn't imagining it. The distance hadn't been mutual. It had been engineered. And someone had quietly decided that real, unmanageable love was dangerous. The second message arrived 3 days after the park bench meeting. It came not by email, but as a folded note tucked under her windshield wiper in the grocery store parking lot. She spotted it just as she was loading a bag of oranges into the back seat. For a moment, she assumed it was another flyer someone advertising window repair or pest control. But when she unfolded the paper, the handwriting stopped her. I knew. Claire and I knew, Thomas. You don't know the half of it. Meet me. One time only. The Arboretum Cafe. Tuesday, noon. Don't be late. Daniel Shea read it twice. Then again, unsure if it was real. The name stirred something faint. Claire had mentioned a Daniel once, years ago, an old college friend of Thomas's, or maybe a former roommate. Someone with whom Thomas had had a falling out, as she recalled. He hadn't been mentioned since. On Tuesday, she arrived 10 minutes early and waited in the back corner of the cafe, half convinced no one would come. But at exactly noon, a man approached. Late 30s, beard unkempt, coat a little too worn. He looked like someone carrying the weight of something unsaid. "Mrs. Whitmore?" he asked, cautious. She nodded. "You're Daniel." He sat, ordered nothing, and pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket. He didn't open it, just kept one hand on top of it, as if it might run away. "I almost didn't come," he said. "But when I heard Claire was gone, and how it happened, or rather how it was explained, I figured maybe someone else needed to know." "Know what?" He leaned forward. "That your instincts weren't wrong." She felt her chest tighten. "Thomas's. Charming," he said carefully. "That's his trick. People think control looks like yelling or violence, but that's not how he does it. He isolates quietly. It's slow. Surgical. With Claire, it started before they even married." He took a deep breath. "I used to be his closest friend. Lived together in Boston during grad school. I saw the way he changed when he met her. Not in love-struck ways. In ownership ways. Like he'd discovered something rare that he had to lock away before anyone else got too close." She said nothing, just listened. "I used to think I was overreacting," he continued. "Then one day Claire called me's. This was years ago. She asked me if it was normal that Thomas didn't like her going to her mother's house alone. Said it disrupted her emotional progress. His words, not hers. Her throat went dry. I told her that wasn't normal, that it sounded like he was trying to sever her support systems. She got quiet after that. We didn't speak again." He looked down. 3 months later, I got a letter from Claire. From Thomas, a cease and desist. Said I was interfering with his family. Threatened legal action. I felt her stomach twist. I didn't respond, Daniel said. Didn't have the money or the will to fight it. But I knew something was wrong. "Why are you telling me now?" she asked. "Because I kept tabs from a distance? And what I saw, Claire, vanishing from the public? Social media gone. Friends blocked. Then her funeral closed door inviolably. You weren't listed. Neither were half the people who actually mattered in her life." He paused, then added quietly, "He always said she was too easily influenced. That people like Miondu were distractions. He wanted her. Simplified." They sat in silence as the low hum of cafe chatter swirled around them. At the next table, someone was laughing. "A coffee cup CLINKED. My double quotes, Mrs. Whitmore," Daniel said, his voice gentler now. "I don't know what you're planning, but if you show up at that service, you won't be welcome." "I already know that," she replied. He nodded. "Just be careful. Thomas doesn't do chaos. He does containment. And grief. Grief is hard to contain." She watched him rise. Slide the notebook back into his jacket, leave without looking back, and in that quiet moment, a new kind of resolve settled over her. They weren't random cuts. They were incisions. Someone had trimmed Claire's life into something small enough to manage. But she remembered the original shape. She would not be contained. She found it by accident. It was a quiet morning, the kind where the sky hangs low and gray like a held breath. Rain tapped gently on the windows. The silence in the house had become something companionable, again less like grief, more like waiting. She had decided to finally go through the kitchen, not for any reason except that she hadn't in a... While the cupboards were lined with mismatched mugs and half-used spices, things Claire had once helped her alphabetize when she was 10. "Turmeric doesn't belong next to thyme, Mom," she'd said, laughing. Proud to get it right, she was reaching behind a stack of old cookbooks when she felt the envelope. It had slipped between the pages of a flour-dusted volume Claire had given her one Christmas, a baking guide she rarely used but never threw away. The envelope was addressed in Claire's handwriting, that soft, upright cursive that always looked like it was just barely keeping itself together. Her name was on it, just Mom, no stamp, no postmark. But the seal was intact. For a moment, she didn't move. Her hand stayed on the paper like it might vanish if she pulled it too quickly. And then, slowly, She sat down at the table, the same one where Claire had once iced cookies and cried over college, rejection letters, and painted little crescent moons in the corners of napkins. When she was nervous, she broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. No date, no salutation. It's just a letter. If anything ever happens to me, and you're reading this, it means I never got brave enough to send it. First, I'm sorry. I've made mistakes. I've let things drift too far between us. And some days it feels like I don't know how to fix it. But you need to know what's never because I didn't love you. Never. Thomas. He's hard to explain. He's not violent. He's not cruel, but he wants control. And he's very, very good at getting it without ever seeming like the bad guy. He doesn't like the way I am when I'm with you. He says I become emotional and less focused. At first, I thought he was trying to help. And then I realized he just wanted me quieter. He started filtering things. My phone, my mail. He said I was too easily overwhelmed and that he needed to help manage what I saw. I let him. I shouldn't have. I don't know what this is turning into. Sometimes I feel like a ghost in my own home. I'm scared of what happens if I ask for. Too much if I say I want out. If you're reading this, maybe I waited too long. I just need you to remember who I was. It's the real me, not the one he tried to shape. Promise me you won't let him bury that. Promise me you won't let me disappear. She read the letter 3 times. The first time through tears. The second, with trembling hands. The third, with something growing deep inside. Hers, low and sharp and irrevocable. Claire had known. Not everything, perhaps. Not how it would end. But she had felt it. The slow erasure, the subtle manipulations. The fear that someday her story might be told by someone who never understood it. And in this envelope, tucked behind a cookbook, was her daughter's final attempt to escape it. A message not of despair, but of resistance. Claire had left her something to hold on to, something no obituary could revise. She pressed the paper to her chest and closed her eyes. No court order, no closed-door funeral. No icy husband with a curated narrative could take this away. She had. Her daughter's voice now, undeniable, unearthed, unedited, and she would not let it be silenced again. She hadn't meant to request the autopsy report. Not at first. Felt like a betrayal, like questioning the end of someone you loved. But after the letter, after Claire's own words, handwritten and tucked away like contraband, it no longer felt optional. It felt like duty. Claire had been afraid. She had doubted the story being written for her. And now it was her mother's job to read between the lines. It took 4 days to obtain a copy. 2 polite but unhelpful phone calls to the funeral home. 3rd, more direct conversation. With the county medical examiner's office, a friend of a friend pulled strings. When the envelope finally arrived, she opened it with shaking hands. Afraid of what it might confirm, but more afraid of what it might overlook. The official cause of death. Respiratory arrest due to chronic asthma complications. No toxicology concerns. No signs of trauma. Time of death estimated between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Discovered by the spouse at approximately 6:42 a.m. Everything looked routine, clean, expected to clean. She sat with the report for hours, rereading the language like scripture, searching for any phrasing that might feel out of place. But nothing shouted, nothing even whispered, until she noticed the attached file, the paramedic report. It was short, it's barely a paragraph. But it mentioned something the death certificate didn't. Claire had been found in bed, lying on her side. But with signs of positional fluid pooling, a small notation that meant she had been in that position for some time before being discovered, which wasn't unusual. Except for one thing. Thomas had told the paramedics he'd just found her. That word just stuck in her mind like a sliver. Small, almost invisible, but deeply lodged. If he'd just found her, why had she already begun showing post-mortem signs? Why had rigor mortis begun to set in by the time Ems arrived? She needed help. That night, after hours of pacing and second-guessing herself, she made a call to an old acquaintance, Dennis Porter, a retired homicide detective turned private investigator. He'd once given a lecture at the library where she worked something about reading crime scenes and the narrative silence of evidence. She remembered how he'd said the truth hides in what no one bothers to explain. Dennis met her the next afternoon at a diner off Route 22. He arrived in a rumpled sport coat, eyes like granite, voice low and free of pretense. She slid the autopsy and EMS report across the table. He read in silence, lips pressed together in a hard line. When he finished, he tapped the time of death estimate. "This window's broad," he said. 2 to 4 a.m., but fluid pooling indicates she wasn't moved. That's consistent with the discovery several hours after death, not moments. So, if he found her at 6:42, Dennis said, she likely died closer to 2 o'clock. That's 4 hours. For hours in the same position. No attempt to resuscitate. No call to 911 until nearly 7. Her stomach turned. But it says she had a history of asthma, which can be fatal, he agreed. But not quietly. People don't slip away from asthma in silence. There's panic, struggling, gasping, furniture overturned, inhalers used. Evidence. There was none of that, none mentioned. He leaned back in the booth, eyes scanning her face. Did Claire keep her medication nearby? Always? She'll use it that night? The report had listed no active medications found near the body. Nothing used. No bronchodilator noted. She would have tried to fight it, her mother whispered. She would have, Dennis said. That's what stands out. A silence settled over the table like a veil. He didn't say what she was thinking. He didn't have to. She paid for their coffee and left the reports with him. I need to know, she told him. Everything, not what was written. What really happened. Dennis nodded, and we start with what doesn't add up. And that, she realized, was almost everything. She wasn't meant to know about the wake. It hadn't been published anywhere, not in the obituary, not on the funeral home's website, not even whispered among extended family. But information, like grief, has a way of seeping through cracks when it's needed most. A former coworker of Claire's, someone who had seen the obituary and thought it odd that her mother wasn't mentioned, reached out quietly. I heard there's something happening Thursday evening, she said in a hushed voice. Closed event, no public notice. But I think it's at Welton Memorial Hall. She didn't ask how the woman knew. She just listened, took down the time, and thanked her without offering anything in return. That night, she didn't plan to crash it. Not really. She told herself she only wanted to see, to bear witness from a distance, to mark, somehow, the day her daughter was mourned by strangers in a room she wasn't allowed to enter. It was raining against them. Silvery lines that blurred the windshield as she parked across the street from the hall.
Ow!
Through the foggy glass, she could see soft lights glowing behind stained glass windows, the kind rented out for curated grief. The kind with matching flower arrangements and a speaker system that played. Sanitized piano music like grief had a soundtrack. She stayed in. The car, engine off, hands curled in her lap. It was enough, she told herself. She'd seen the place. That was enough then, just before 7. Someone caught her eye. A woman stepped out of a dark sedan tall, with long gray hair pinned into a neat bun, and a red coat that stood out like a poppy against the black umbrellas dotting the sidewalk. She moved with purpose, not toward the main entrance, but around the side of the building, holding something close to her chest. A bouquet. Lilies and hydrangeas. Fresh. She wasn't young, but she walked like someone who had been summoned. Someone who had a task to complete. Curiosity pulled her from the car. She followed at a distance, careful, invisible. The red-coated woman disappeared into a side entrance with no signage. A service door, meant for staff perhaps, or last-minute deliveries. She waited a moment, then moved closer. Close enough to see the door hadn't shut all the way. She didn't go in, she didn't need to. What happened next happened in glimpses. The woman walked past the entryway and into the viewing room. The casket stood closed, surrounded by white roses. A small display of photographs was arranged beside it. Claire at her wedding. Claire painting, Claire smiling in Thomas's arms. But none of them included her mother, not one. The woman in the red coat stepped forward, placed the bouquet gently on the table beside the casket, and took a small envelope from her coat pocket. She laid it on the lid of the casket with both hands, slowly, reverently. Then, without speaking to anyone, she turned and left the room. Her mother moved back, retreating into the shadows before she could be seen. She waited until the woman had returned to her car and driven off before stepping forward, compelled by something she couldn't name. Through the open door, she entered the room just far enough to see the casket. No one noticed her. The voices had drifted to the far end of the hall where Thomas stood talking to two older women in black. She crossed quickly, picked up the envelope, and slipped it into her coat. It was simple. White, handwritten. One sentence inside. Forgive him.
Oh.
That night, she sat in the kitchen with the note before her like a puzzle that refused to solve itself. The handwriting was familiar in a vague, haunting way, but no full name, no return address, no explanation. Forgive him. Not mourn with him. Not believe him. Forgive who was M. And what did she know? A door had opened. Someone else, perhaps closer to the truth than anyone realized, had left a message not for the mourners, but for the mother locked outside the story. She waited. 3 days after the wake, before going to the house, it wasn't a decision made in haste. She rehearsed what she would say more times than she could count. In the mirror, in the car, in the silence of her kitchen, where grief had taken up permanent residence and started to hang its coat. She didn't want to fight. She wanted answers, or at least acknowledgement. Something real and scripted, from the man who now stood as the final voice in Claire's life, the one who had buried her, the one who had closed the doors and drawn the curtains and carefully curated the narrative around her death. Thomas hadn't called, hadn't written, hadn't even responded when she left a message after finding the letter in the cookbook. She had kept her voice steady, calm, trying not to sound accusatory. But there had been no return call, no text, no word of any kind, so she drove to the house. The driveway was empty, save for a sleek silver SUV she recognized as his. The curtains in the front window were drawn shut, the porch light off despite the creeping dusk. It looked like no one was home, but she knew better. She stood at the front door, hands clenched to hide their trembling, and rang the bell. No answer. She rang it again, then knocked. It took nearly 2 full minutes before the door opened, not wide, but just a crack. Thomas appeared, framed in the gap, like a man peering into a world he wished would go away. He didn't look surprised. He looked tired and annoyed. "I told the funeral home to limit contact," he said. No greeting, no warmth. Just that measured voice, like someone moderating a conference call. "I'm not the funeral home," she replied. He opened the door another inch. She could see into the foyer now. Claire's old boots were still by the door, the umbrella stand she'd painted years ago. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. "I don't want a scene," he said. "Neither do I," she said. Want answers? There's nothing to explain." Claire had asthma. It was tragic, but not unexpected. She stepped closer. "Then why did she write me a letter saying she was scared of you?" It landed, like a punch, but like a silence. That sucked all the air out of the space between them. His expression didn't change. But the door stopped opening. "You need to go," he said. "Quieter now. I'm not leaving without understanding what happened. You didn't call me. You left me out of her obituary, her funeral, her life. She wanted it that way," he said flatly. "No, she didn't," she snapped. "She told you what you wanted to hear because she was trying to survive you. That did it." The door slammed shut in her face. She stood there, blinking at the wood grain, the quiet thudding of her own heartbeat in her ears. Then came the click of the deadbolt. A few seconds later, she heard the voice on the phone, faint. Behind the glass, he was calling the police. She didn't wait for them to arrive. She walked back to her car slowly, her face burning, her spine straight. When the patrol car passed her on the road a few minutes later, she kept her eyes on the horizon, refusing to pull over, refusing to be questioned like a trespasser on her own daughter's history. Back home, she locked the door behind her, not out of fear, but to hold in the shaking. The humiliation of being treated like a threat instead of a mother. But it wasn't just the insult. It was the way he'd said it. She wanted it that way. He wasn't just rewriting Claire's death. He had rewritten her life. And now he was defending the edit like it was gospel. Like her mother had never belonged on the page at all. The morning was overcast, the kind of colorless gray that made everything feel distant. Washed out like the sky itself had gone numb. She dressed in black, not because anyone would see her, but because it felt like the only thing left within her control. A long wool coat, plain shoes, no makeup. Nothing performative. It's just presence, just grief. The funeral was scheduled for 10 a.m., according to the private notice, passed quietly from one whisper to another. No public bulletin, no announcement in the local paper. A closed circle, sealed tightly by Thomas's authority. She parked across the street from St. Francis Cemetery, far enough to avoid notice, close enough to see the procession. Her car sat idle beneath the low-hanging branches of a sycamore, its leaves fluttering like they were trying to say something but couldn't find the words. At 9:45, the first vehicles began to arrive. Black sedans with tinted windows, a hearse that gleamed too brightly against the dull sky, and a small gathering of mourners dressed with quiet elegance. They exited their cars solemnly, each one carrying with them the kind of rehearsed sadness reserved for ceremonies. Men with polished shoes and clasped hands, women with veiled hats and long unmoving faces. No one cried. She scanned the group. Carefully, familiar faces surfaced, but none looked her way. One of Claire's former colleagues, a woman she vaguely recognized from the wedding photos. No one from Claire's childhood, no teachers, no neighbors, no one who had known her before she became Claire Darrow, and of course, not her. She remained in the car, engine off, hands resting. In her lap, as if she were waiting for a signal that would never come. At 10:02, the casket was removed from the hearse. Polished mahogany, gleaming even in the gray light. It looked heavy, and all she imagined what lay inside her daughter dressed. Not by loving hands, but by professionals paid to mimic the care of the living. Claire's hair would be brushed, her hands folded. They would have covered the scar on her chin from falling off her bike in 3rd grade. No one here would know how she got it. The small crowd followed the casket to the burial site near the edge of the cemetery. She watched from behind the glass as the ceremony began. A man in robes she didn't recognize spoke from a laminated script. His voice didn't carry far, but his gestures were clear, comforting, practiced. She wondered what he was saying. What words were being spoken about her daughter by people who had only known a version of her? The version Thomas allowed, the version that fit. Claire hated formality. She would have wanted music, something loud. She would have wanted stories, laughter even. She would have wanted her mother, but none of that was here. No one crossed the street. No one looked around to see who might be missing. No one called her name. She was a shadow. And Claire was being laid to rest in the arms of strangers. When the casket was lowered, her breath caught. Not from the finality of it she'd already accepted that Claire was going to, but from the realization that this moment, the one designed to offer closure, had been constructed to exclude her, to rewrite her role from mother to absence. As the group began to disperse, umbrellas opened overhead. The rain had returned light, almost imperceptible, like the sky weeping without drawing attention to itself. She stayed in the car until they were all gone, till the hearse drove off and the last of the mourners vanished into waiting vehicles. Only then did she cross the street. She walked to the grave fresh, unsettled, marked with a temporary wooden stake bearing Claire's name. No flowers, no handwritten notes, just soil, dark and damp. She knelt beside it, one hand pressed against the earth, and whispered, "I'm here." No priest, no podium, just a mother, unseen, but not absent. Never absent. The cemetery was locked. By sundown, she waited for the last light to disappear behind the slope of the hill before parking her car 2 blocks away. It wasn't fear that guided her steps through the side streets, it was reverence. Quiet determination, like the kind her own mother once walked with when bringing candles to grave sites long forgotten by time. She wore the same black coat, the same plain shoes, but her hands were not empty this time. They held something far more intimate than lilies or roses. The box was small, covered in soft green velvet, and bound with a white ribbon. Inside were fragments of Claire's life things no one at the funeral that morning would have recognized, let alone valued. A hand-folded paper star from a childhood art project, the pressed petal from her first school dance corsage, a worn Polaroid of the two of them grinning at the county fair, cotton candy smudged across Claire's cheek, and the letter, the one she had found in the cookbook, folded again. Resting on top, the front gates were chained, but the side entrance, barely visible from the road, had been left ajar. A narrow break in the fencing, overgrown and likely forgotten. She slipped through it easily. The night was hushed, the kind of quiet that seems to hold its breath. The ground was soft beneath her feet, the grass still damp from morning rain. The scent of turned earth still lingered in the air, faint but sharp like memory itself. She found the grave easily. It was unmarked, still just the wooden stake. The disturbed soil, the place where a name now lay beneath the ground instead of above it. She knelt again, not hurried this time, not weeping. And then she opened the box. "I brought you something," she whispered. She laid the items gently atop. The fresh soil, not in a row, but in a small cluster like a makeshift altar. Personal, quiet, true. The photo faced up. The paper star caught the moonlight. The letter she tucked just beneath the edge of a stone, hidden but present. There were no crowds now, no curated speakers, no strangers writing her daughter's story. Just her, just this. Real grief. Real love. A wind passed through the trees above, lifting a few dry leaves into the air. And for a moment she imagined Claire there with her knelling beside her, laughing softly at the old photo, teasing her about the corsage, crying. As she reread her own letter, that was the Claire she remembered. Not the one buried beneath ceremony, but the one who had lived between the cracks. Messy, wild, loving. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the small recorder Dennis had given her earlier that week. They'd been gathering details, testing timelines. He wasn't ready to make any conclusions yet, but he had advised her quietly to start keeping records. Not everything will come through the courts, he'd said. But truth has a way of building its own archive. She clicked it on. "My name is Margaret Whitmore," she said. Her voice was calm, clear. "I'm standing at my daughter Claire's grave. I wasn't allowed to attend her funeral. I wasn't. Told when she died? I wasn't named in her obituary. I'm here to say she mattered, and I was her mother." She let the silence follow those words, let them settle into the cold night air. She didn't cry, not because she was numb, but because this moment wasn't for sorrow. It was for reclamation. She placed the recorder beside the box and stood, brushing her hands against her coat. Before she left, she whispered one more thing. "They buried you without me. I remember who you are. I'll make sure the world does too." Then she turned, stepped back into the darkness, and disappeared the same way she'd come, quietly, but not empty. Never empty again. The recorder had been at the bottom of her handbag for weeks, tucked between a weathered notepad and an old chapstick, forgotten in the rhythm of days too heavy to carry much else. She hadn't even remembered putting it there, not the new one Dennis had given her. The old one, the one Claire had gifted her one Christmas years ago, when she was still in college. "For your poems," Claire had said, wrapping it in silver tissue and laughing. "Or your thoughts. Or grocery lists that sound profound." She hadn't used it much. It had migrated from desk drawer to bookshelf to handbag, in the way sentimental things often do too, cherished to toss. Too ordinary to honor properly. And yet it was still there. She found it on a Tuesday, the same day Dennis had called with a quiet update. Nothing conclusive yet, but more gaps in Thomas's timeline, more inconsistencies. He promised details soon. She was looking for a receipt. When her fingers brushed the small black device, the screen was scratched, plastic worn smooth from years of being moved but not used. She nearly set it aside, but she didn't. She pressed play on instinct, at first only static. A low ambient hiss. Then the faint click of a button being pressed and a voice nodders. At first, barely a whisper. "Is this working?" Then louder, still soft but unmistakably her. "Mom, I don't know if you still check this." I don't know if this thing even records anymore. But I needed to. Say something. The air left her lungs. She sat down hard on the edge of her bed. The recorder clutched in both hands, her whole body still. I know I haven't been calling, Claire's voice continued. I know you think I'm pulling away, and I am. Hate that I am. But it's not because I don't love you. It's just ... It's complicated here. He's complicated. Tells me I'm too sensitive, that you make it worse, that you stir things up. Pause. You used to tell me that love doesn't shrink you, that if you feel smaller around someone, it's not love, it's control. I didn't get it then. I do now. The recording crackled slightly, a soft inhale. Some days I want to leave. Some days I think I'm already gone. The voice trembled, but it kept going. If something happens, want you to know I tried. I really tried. I thought I could love him into being different. I thought I could make it work if I was better, quieter, less me. Another long pause, then a single, quiet sob. I miss you. I miss who I was with you. And I'm sorry if I've made you feel forgotten. I didn't forget. I just got lost. Silence then, just before the message ends. If this ever matters, if anyone ever questions if I didn't choose to vanish. That was never my choice. The recorder clicked off. She sat there for a long time, the device still warm in her hand from where she'd pressed it too tightly. There were no tears, not at first. It's a sense of stunned, terrible clarity. Claire had spoken months ago, alone. Afraid, reaching through whatever barrier had been built around her. And the message had been there the whole time, buried. Beneath errands and receipts and days that passed without knowing, she listened to it again, then again. Each time the weight of it settled deeper. This wasn't just a memory. This was evidence. Claire had spoken not just to be heard, but to be remembered. She had known something was wrong. She had feared what might come, and she had left this not as a goodbye, but as a breadcrumb. Proof. And now, finally, her voice would not be ignored. She hadn't planned to share it. At first, the idea of broadcasting her grief felt like a betrayal too public, too exposed. But something had shifted inside her after finding the recorder. After hearing Claire's voice pled from a device forgotten at the bottom of a purse. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. She kept hearing that one line echo in her mind, like a bell underwater. I didn't choose to vanish. Claire hadn't been erased. She'd been buried, live in silence. And now that silence was cracking. The blog had been dormant for years. A simple site she had started long ago to share poems and old recipes. Nothing elaborate, nothing viral. Just a quiet corner of the internet where her thoughts lived in soft fonts and muted backgrounds. The password had taken her 20 minutes to remember. She didn't design the post. She didn't fuss with formatting. She just opened the window and began typing. This is for my daughter, Clara Lane Whitmore Darrow. She passed away last month. I wasn't invited to her funeral. I wasn't mentioned in her obituary. I was told to stay away. But I was her mother, and she mattered. She attached the audio file, just the raw recording from the old voice recorder, static and all. No edits. No music. No explanation. Just Claire. As she was. As she wanted to be heard. Underneath, she added, if you knew Claire, truly knew her, you know this isn't how her story should end. She didn't choose this silence. She didn't choose to disappear. She posted it at 2:12 a.m. and closed the laptop. She didn't expect anyone to see it, but by morning, the post had been shared 17 times. By noon, it was over 100. By nightfall, it had reached thousands. It started with Claire's old friends, college classmates, high school. Teachers, one of her coworkers from the gallery who wrote, I always wondered why she drifted away. This breaks me. Another from her art therapist, now in another state. She never stopped talking about her mother in our first sessions. You could feel the love in her voice. Then came the strangers. People who had never met Claire, but had their own Claires. Their own mothers. Their own daughters. People who had lost someone to silence, to manipulation, to control, disguised as devotion. Some wrote paragraphs. Some just left candle emojis. Some said nothing at all, just reshared the audio, letting Claire speak for herself. By the third day, a small podcast picked it up. A grief and trauma counselor used it in a segment about emotional coercion and isolation. By the end of the week, an advocacy group for survivors of relational abuse reached out, asking permission to link the post. To their site, she read every message. Some made her weep, some made her furious. One simply said, "Thank you. I've never heard my own pain so clearly in someone else's voice." The blog was no longer hers. It had become something larger, a memorial, yes, but also a rebellion against false narratives, against omissions, against grief with rules. She wasn't seeking revenge, it was reclaiming truth. And now, Claire wasn't being remembered for the way she died. She was being remembered for the way she tried to live, for the voice she left behind, for the mother who refused to let that voice go unheard, for a love that had not disappeared but simply waited patient, unwavering, until the world was ready to listen. The package arrived without a return address. It was small plain cardboard, sealed with heavy tape, the kind used to ship textbooks or hardbound volumes. No name on the label, just her address, typed in a nondescript sans serif font, centered and perfect. It arrived at night. She found it on her porch, just after 11, illuminated by the porch light that flickered every few minutes, casting shadows like a slow strobe. She brought it inside, set it gently on the kitchen table, and stared at it for a long while, unsure if she wanted to open it or call someone first. She didn't recognize the handwriting. There was no signature, no markings, only a note slipped. Under the flap typed like the label, "I thought you deserved to know." That was all. She took a breath, reached for the scissors, and cut the tape. Inside, wrapped in a faded scarf, she immediately recognized as Claire's mustard yellow. Frayed at the edges was a journal, hard-bound, black leather cover, the elastic. Strap had worn thin. It smelled faintly of lavender and something else, paint, maybe. Old paper. Her hands trembled. She carried it to the living room, turned on the reading lamp beside the armchair, and sat down slowly, knees weak with anticipation and dread. For a long time she simply held it. Then she opened to the first page. Claire's handwriting, her real, unfiltered handwriting, slightly slanted, a little messy at the edges, the kind she hadn't seen since the letters she used to leave on the fridge in college. The first entry was dated nearly 2 years ago. January 3rd, Thomas says the journal is a distraction. But I need somewhere to think. Somewhere private. Somewhere that doesn't talk back. The next few pages were filled with notes. About her art. Half-thoughts. Dreams. Color palettes. Quotes scribbled sideways in the margins. But as the weeks went on, the entries changed. He says, "I let people influence me too much. That my mom's voice is in my head more than my own. I asked if I want to be a wife or a daughter. I didn't know how to answer. He threw my phone on the couch today. Not at me, just ... near me. It startled me. I laughed, but only because I didn't know what else to do. I want to go home for Easter. He says we'll be traveling, somewhere remote. It's disconnected, he called it. Says holidays just stir things up. I don't think I know how to leave anymore. Or if I'd even be safe trying." The entries blurred in her vision. Some pages were stained maybe with tears, maybe paint. Some had whole sentences scratched out violently. Others were written in a trembling hand, words uneven and pressured into the paper too deeply. Then came the last entry, dated for months before Claire's death. "I've started making a plan, just a small one, just in case. I've saved copies of a few things. I've told someone close where to find this journal. I don't want to be paranoid. But if something ever happens, I want my mother to know I didn't go quietly. I want her to know I never stopped loving her, even when I couldn't say it out. Loud, she'll understand. She always did." That was the final line. The rest of the journal was blank. She closed it slowly, her fingers resting on the cover as if she were holding Claire's hand. Midnight had passed. The house was dark, silent, but everything had changed. This wasn't just a daughter's diary. This was a witness Claire had documented. What no one else had seen would have been smoothed over in eulogies and buried beneath. Scripted sorrow. It was raw, fragmented, but it was truth. And someone who had known, had chosen to send it. An act of quiet defiance, or guilt, or justice. Whoever they were. They had passed the flame, and now it burned in her hands. She read the journal in fragments. Over 3 sleepless nights, it wasn't the kind of book you could consume all at once. There was no arc, no tidy resolution. Just pieces, scribbled thoughts, confessions that came in waves, sometimes pages apart. The entries weren't always dated. Some were barely legible. A few ended mid-sentence, as if Claire had been interrupted, or lost the courage to continue. But together, pages formed something undeniable. A portrait of control, drawn slowly, painfully, in her daughter's own hand. He checks the bank. Statements now, every month. He says it's easier if one of us handles the bills, but it means I can't buy anything without an explanation. Last week he asked why I ordered a book on trauma. I told him it was for a friend. He smiled and said, "That's cute." Another entry. I wanted to go back to work part-time at the gallery. He said it was too far to commute and not worth the gas. Then I offered to freelance. He said, "That's just a hobby." And another, I asked about the savings account, the one I opened before we got married. He said we should consolidate everything. It's cleaner that way. He closed it without telling me. Transferred it all. Now I don't have access unless he logs me in. Her mother paused at that page, hands tightening around the edges. Financial secrecy. Isolation disguised as efficiency. Dependency cloaked in protection. It was all there in the gaps between the lines. In the way Claire never outright said the word trapped, but described every symptom of it. It's like a map drawn in invisible ink. Only now, with everything she knew, did it start to glow? Sometimes I pretend I'm someone else, just for a few minutes. I imagine I live in a tiny apartment and buy my own groceries, and no one ever makes me account for what I think or feel. Then he calls my name, and it all folds back in. He told me once that I'm not built for solitude, that I fall apart without supervision. It sounded like a joke. But then he said it again last week, and this time it didn't sound funny. I wonder how much of me has changed, or if it's just buried somewhere under the version he wants me to be. Then came the entry that chilled her. If he finds this journal, he'll say I'm exaggerating, or unstable. He'll call it emotional theater. That's his phrase. Emotional theater. He says I perform distress to get attention. But if I don't write this down, I'll forget what's real and what isn't. And still, Claire kept writing. I miss my mom. I miss how she used to see me. Like I was whole, like I wasn't made of compromises. I wanted to call her tonight. I sat on the floor with the phone in my hand for 20 minutes. Then I remembered he checks the call log. I put it back. The realization hit like a weight dropped from a great height. Claire had tried to leave, maybe not physically, but emotionally, mentally. She had reached for escape in the only ways she could. Paper, voice recordings, dreams, but she'd been cornered in increments until even dialing a phone number felt like a risk too large to take. He says if I ever try to leave, I'll lose everything, and no one will believe me. I don't have the temperament for independence. The words were clinical, practiced, as if she'd heard them too many times. Her mother closed the journal, but only for a moment. The silence of the house around her felt heavier than usual, like the walls themselves had absorbed some of what she'd read. This was what Thomas hadn't wanted anyone to see. Not bruises or chaos, but erosion. A woman chipped away until she no longer recognized herself, but Claire had left behind the truth, and now her mother held it in her hands like a fuse waiting to be lit. She didn't call it a funeral. That word had been stripped of. Its meaning, she called it a gathering, a remembrance, something small, something true. There would be no casket, no velvet ropes, no curated eulogies written by someone who had never understood who Claire really was. Just voices, just people who had known her before the silence. She rented a room at the old community center, echoing. Space with creaky wood floors, high windows, and folding chairs that never sat evenly. It was the same place where Claire had once hosted an art class for children during a summer break in college. The walls still bore smudges of crayon and faint fingerprints of a time when her daughter's laughter had filled the air like paint. She invited everyone. Thomas hadn't. She sent handwritten notes to old friends, teachers, neighbors. She posted quietly in a few local forums using Claire's full name. No flowers requested. No dress code. Just memories. Just presents. She didn't expect a crowd, but they came anyway. They arrived in trickles first. A woman with silver hair who used to walk her dog past their house every morning. Then a teacher from the high school art department. A man who'd worked with Claire at the bookstore when she was 19, a barista. An aunt who hadn't been called in years. And Millicycler's college roommate who hugged her at the door and said, simply, she would have wanted this. By the time the clock struck 3, the room was nearly full. She stood at the front, not behind a podium, but just beside a table draped in linen, where she had placed the small velvet box she'd left at the grave. Inside it, the Polaroid, the paper star, the worn scarf that had wrapped the journal. Beside it, a single framed photo Claire, barefoot in the garden. Arms stretched wide, face upturned to the sun. There was no ceremony, no structure. She simply stepped forward and said, if you knew her, please speak. And they did. One by one, people rose. A woman in her 30s described how Claire once helped her pick out a wedding dress she couldn't afford. To hem it for free, in exchange for coffee and company, an elderly man said. Claire had painted a mural on the side of his garage when his wife died. Unprompted, just to give him something beautiful to look at. A teenager from the community gallery remembered how Claire had told her, don't let anyone talk you out of the weird parts of yourself. That's the good stuff. Each voice added color. Laughter returned to the room. And tears, yes, but not the restrained kind offered behind veils and polite silence. These were messy human tears. Loved ones remembering a woman in full dimension, not the polished version Thomas had buried, but the real Claire. Bright, fierce, complex, funny, flawed, alive. No. One mentioned Thomas. No one needed to. His absence hung in the air like a shadow on the edge of light, but it never reached the center. Not here. At the end, she played the voice recording. Claire's voice filled the room, not the tearful confession from the old recorder, but a clip from years ago, one she'd forgotten she had saved. Claire was laughing, trying to read a poem aloud but stumbling over her own words. I'm starting over, she'd said between giggles. Cut that part. It's terrible. The room smiled through their tears. That was who she had been. Afterward, as people began to leave, they embraced her with the gentleness reserved for survivors of something unspeakable, not just grief but erasure. You gave her back to us, someone whispered. But she didn't respond, because the truth was simpler than that. Claire had never left. She had only been quieted, and now her name had been spoken again, not by strangers in suits, but by those who remembered the sound of her voice. And in that small and perfect room, justice had begun, not with indictments, but with remembrance. She didn't expect Thomas to come, even as she addressed the handwritten invitations and quietly made calls to the people he'd left off his version of mourning. She never truly believed he would appear, not at the gathering, not among people who remembered Claire before him. Not in a room where love wasn't curated but earned. Still, part of her wondered. Not out of hope, but out of curiosity. What does a man do when the narrative slips from his hands? When the version of the story he controlled begins to splinter under the weight of truth? The answer was simple. He did nothing. He didn't reply to her message. He didn't send a card. He didn't come to the memorial. For a man who had managed every detail of Claire's life, her money, her movements, even her obituary, he offered nothing when the version of Claire that couldn't be stage managed came to life. Again, in the voices of those who had truly known her, but others came. And not just the ones she had called. As the last guests trickled in, just before the photo was placed on the linen-covered table, she saw her, the woman in the red coat. It took her a moment to place her, but once she did, her breath caught. The same woman who had appeared at the wake, who had moved past the casket with quiet grace, who had left behind the note that simply read, "Forgive him." This time, she walked without haste, her silver hair unpinned and loose over her shoulders. She carried no bouquet, just a small, sealed envelope in her gloved hand. Their eyes met as she entered. For a brief second, something passed between them, not recognition, exactly, but mutual understanding. Two women who had stood outside the same locked room after the last story had been shared and the final. Tear gently wiped away. The woman approached her. She spoke softly. "I wasn't sure if I should come. Remember you," she replied. "From the cemetery?" The woman nodded. "I didn't want to stay long that day. I just needed to see her." She glanced at the table where the small box sat, where Claire's scarf was folded like a relic. "I knew Claire," she said. "Long before Thomas." Her voice didn't waver, but her eyes did, just slightly. "I used to work with him," she said. "At the firm years ago, we were never close, but I saw how he moved through people, how he isolated, repositioned. He was a master of framing a story before anyone else had a chance. To write it?" The mother listened, silent. "I didn't do anything," the woman said quietly. "Not then. I saw signs, heard things. I told myself it wasn't my place." She held out the envelope. "I found something Claire left behind. It was with some of his old files. Forgotten, I think, or hidden. She must have trusted me once. I don't know why she gave it to me or when, but it's hers, and it's yours now." She took the envelope. The weight of it felt heavier than paper should. The woman gave a small nod. "I'm sorry I wasn't brave earlier. We all tell ourselves silence is kindness, but it's not. It's just distance." She left quietly, the red coat vanishing down. The hallway like a flame receding into dusk. Later at home, she opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph. Claire in front of her easel, painting with furious joy, sleeves rolled up, her face streaked with color. On the back in Claire's handwriting, "This is who I really am. Don't let him make you forget," and she wouldn't, not now. Not ever. Key arrived in a padded envelope, postmarked 2 days after the gathering. No note, no signature, just a single silver key and a building number. Scribbled in the corner of the envelope, she knew immediately where it led. Claire's apartment. The one she'd shared with Thomas. The place she had only seen in photos. Always pristine, always minimal. Cold modern furniture, straight lines, walls the color of fog. Claire's warmth never seemed to live there, but now, for the first time, it was hers to enter. She drove in silence. The building was tucked at the edge of the city, past the rows of office parks and rental units that looked identical in the gray light. The lobby was sterile beige tile, fake plants, the faint hum of a vending machine. No one stopped her. No one asked. The key turned easily in the lock. The apartment smelled like dust and leftover citrus cleaner. Everything had been wiped down. Staged, erased. But not completely. She stood in the doorway for a long time. The couch was still there, gray and rigid. The rug beneath it untouched. A bookshelf half empty. No framed photos. No warmth. But there were traces. A chipped mug tucked. Behind a lamp, a scarf draped over the back of a chair that didn't match the decor. A small hair tie looped around the knob of a drawer. She moved slowly, not out of fear, but reverence. This was the last space Claire had lived in. Not just occupied, but endured. In the bedroom, the bed was made too tightly, like a hotel room. A jewelry box sat unopened on the dresser, its velvet worn at the edges. She opened it gently. Inside, a few earrings, a necklace she hadn't seen since Claire's college graduation, and a tiny folded note. "If you're reading this, I hope it means I've finally found a way out. Please don't blame yourself. It was never you. It was the slow forgetting of who I was and how long it took me to remember. Tell them I loved them, even when I didn't say it right. And Mom, if this ever finds you, I never stopped being your girl." Her breath caught, her hands trembling as she folded the note back into its place. In the closet, most of the clothing was gone. Just a few coats, shoes lined up in military rows. But behind them, tucked into a canvas bag at the back, she found a small box. Wooden, handmade. The kind Claire used to build in her sculpture classes. She opened it. Inside, postcards. Dozens of them. All written, none mailed, each one addressed to her. Some just a few words. Others filled from corner to corner. Saw someone with your laugh today, miss you. I dreamed of our garden again. The daisies are still blooming. Wish I'd called. I wish she sat on the edge of the bed, reading them one by one. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full. Layered. Claire had been speaking. Even when no one was listening, she stayed there until the sun lowered and the room turned gold and then dim again. Before she left, she opened the windows. Let the air move. Let the stillness lift. She didn't take anything with her except the postcards. The rest would wait. Some things didn't need to be sorted right away. As she locked the door behind her, she looked back once. The room didn't feel haunted. It felt paused, and somewhere deep in the quiet, she felt her daughter not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as something whole again. Not gone, still here in pages and paint, in the spaces where her voice had never really faded. And finally, in the silence after the storm piece,